Well, actually, I have to say that, Mark, you and I have a lot in common because I'm going to talk about chickens as well. They feature prominently in this. And my mother is actually a historian who specializes in Moroccan history and wrote her dissertation on Moulay Ismail. So I actually spent my childhood hearing about this guy, so I can't believe that you actually, I've never heard him in an audience. I never expected to hear him in Sarasota. You guys are a brave bunch, those of you who have really completed the marathon here, or almost, and I'm going to take a risk because my clock is ticking, because I know that you had sugar a couple hours ago and everything peaked just about 5 minutes ago, and now you're about to crash. So if you could all just stand up one last time and take a quick stretch before we, because I feel so good. Okay, great. So when you think about your own health, and you can sit down whenever you want to, what you think about is like exercise, right? Or eating right, or managing your stress, or having close connections with family. But I bet you that most of you don't think about this. This is not a close-up of the microbes inside your gut that everybody's very excited about these days. This is actually an electron microscope picture of soil. And these are some proud representatives of the billions and billions of microbes that exist in the soil. And believe it or not, the next little bit, I'm going to tell you why these guys are so important to your own health. But just to give you a little background on me, other than the fact that my mother was a historian of Moroccan history, this is actually where I spend a lot of my week. I'm a practicing family physician. I work in an 8x10 room with a fluorescent light overhead. And I did a whole project on nutrition and trying to figure out what were the best diets for my patients. And it ended up being a wonderful journey where I actually traveled around the world, discovering traditional diets around the world and figuring out what made them so healthy. And then after this whole project, I suddenly realized that I'd missed something really important, and that I really had not figured out how the food was grown and what was sort of the underpinning of all these diets. Where did that food come from? And I realized that I needed to start really learning, going deep and learning about soil. But I'm a physician, so what did I do? I went to PubMed, which is one of the premier medical research engines, and I put in the words soil and human health. You can go home and do this afterwards. So I did that, and these are pretty much the key words that came up. Radon, heavy metals, pesticides, pathogenic yeast. You get the picture. It makes soil sound like it's a horrifically dangerous place. Certainly not anywhere where you would ever want to let your children play or touch yourself, and definitely not a place that you would want to eat from. This just did not make sense to me, right? So I decided I needed a more hands-on learning experience. So I headed out to the farms to actually learn from farmers who were farming in what I considered to be a sustainable or healthy way. And what I'd like to do in the next little bit is explain to you a couple lessons that I extracted from learning from these farmers. And what I really began to understand is that soil, in effect, is kind of an extension of our own organ systems. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more. I'm going to tell you 3 different organ systems that it helps us with. So the first is soil as digestive system. And I know that many of you, like me, are very concerned about getting the proper nutrients. As a matter of fact, Philip and I were in downtown Sarasota yesterday, and we saw this on a window in your pharmacy down there. Someone's trying to sell B12 shots to amp, the amount of B vitamins in your body. There's a big needle behind there. It's really something about vitamin cocktails. Not really the way I would want to get my nutrients. And Eric and Wendy Hawkinson, I think, pretty much agree with me. They are two farmers who live in Washington State, and they took over a piece of land in the Snoqualmie Valley because they wanted to grow fruits and vegetables that would nourish their community, that would give them an optimum amount of nutrition. So they started to farm this little piece of land, and the fruits and vegetables that were coming out of it looked sick and tired, and were actually having poor levels of Brix testing. I don't know if there are any farmers in the audience, but it's a way of actually assessing nutrient value of what you're growing. And the soil itself was incredibly depleted. It had been in monoculture for years, and then kids had ridden dirt bikes over it and really taken the top layer, the healthy layer. So they did what a lot of farmers do when they're trying to replenish the soil. They bought a bunch of additives, kind of like injecting the B12 into our body. They started to inject minerals into the soil and started to buy fertilizer and so on. And they continued to do soil testing and Brix testing on their vegetables, and what they were getting was not terribly satisfactory. So they decided, that's it. No more supplements. We're dumping the vitamins, we're dumping the minerals. It's kind of like my patients that go after I talk to them and take their huge bag of supplements that they got somewhere else and throw them in the trash. Instead, they decided what they were going to do is start to farm the way that nature farms. They were going to start to use local seeds and take all the vegetable waste that they got from the farm and deliver it back into the soil as compost. And they were going to have animals as part of the fertility system of the farm. And they were going to conserve water, and they were going to have a whole diversity of plants and animals. And when they started to do this, all of a sudden, everything began to flourish, and they started to get these beautiful fruits and vegetables and really nourish their community. Very happy story. The Brix testing on their vegetables really, really improved. So what's going on here? How did Eric and Wendy all of a sudden turn this farm by using this new method into something that was truly nourishing us and acting as a source of vitamins and minerals for all of us? Well, the answer gets back, once again, to these guys, these microbes in the soil that really, in a way, are acting like our accessory digestive system. Now, what researchers have discovered is that, and I know it's end of day, you don't want to be looking at any more figures, but I promise I'm going to walk you through this one. What they discovered when they test the microbial life in organic soil, or that kind of full cycle way of farming that Eric and Wendy were doing, and they compare that to the microbial life in conventional soil, where they're just dumping additives and fertilizers and pesticides in, what they found is that everything above the blue line represents a higher concentration of a certain kind of DNA of microbe in organic, versus if it's below the blue line, it shows a higher concentration in conventional soil. So what you're essentially seeing is this intense amount of life in organic soil that is not there in conventional soil. You're also seeing a lot more diversity. They found about 200 more species in the organic soil than they found in the conventional soil. Well, why do we care about that? It turns out that when you have a higher concentration and more diverse microbes in the soil, they're there to break down the organic matter and feed the fruits and vegetables, but they also might play a much more specific role. You might be getting the right bug for the right job. And let me explain this to you. It turns out that we're discovering that there are specific bacteria and certain fungi and certain types of microbes that are actually extra good at breaking down certain kinds of fruits and vegetables and delivering certain vitamins and minerals in those fruits and vegetables so that you can then digest them a little bit better. So what ends up happening is that you actually get this sort of pre-digestion that happens by those microbes. And when you eat that plant after it has been exposed to these microbes, you're getting it a little bit more of it. And this is something that is being discovered in Canada. This is another way that these microbes work as sort of our accessory digestive system. And this was a landmark study that was done originally in France, and now we're starting to find this over and over again. And what happened was that researchers started to realize that depending on where your fruits and vegetables are grown and in what kind of soil, you might be getting specific kinds of nutrients. So in this instance, it was seaweed that they were looking at, and a microbe that was very, very good at digesting seaweed and extracting the nutrients from seaweed. Now you're saying seaweed, that's not in soil, but I kind of think of water as the aqueous equivalent to soil. So this microbe was very, very good at digesting seaweed. And they looked throughout the entire animal kingdom using 16S RNA libraries, which we can do now, and sort of look where else the same DNA exists that was in the bacteria. And they found it, in fact, in the intestines of Japanese people who eat a lot of seaweed. And it had become a part of their microbiome. So in fact, the microbes had sort of hitchhiked over generations from the seaweed to the intestines of people who eat a lot of seaweed and made them much more able to digest nutrients from that seaweed. This is just the beginning of this kind of discovery, and we're realizing that depending on where we get our food, it's actually, there are microbes from that soil that are hitchhiking into us and making it easier for us to digest our food. So I'll let you choose how you want to get your nutrients. Do you want to get it from what's on the left or what's on the right? The second idea is soil as immune system. And this was taught to me by Cody Holmes, who's a rancher, who lives actually in the Ozarks. And he has a ranch called Rockin' H Ranch. And he used to be a very conventional rancher, injecting hormones and antibiotics and wormicides and vermicides and all kinds of things into his animals. And he started to realize that he was losing money because he was buying all these supplements, and that he didn't want to feed these animals to his own kids. So he changed his whole ranching system to one that was much more what he called holistic. And it actually ended up looking a lot like what Chris was showing us up in Serbia. Was that in Siberia? I'm sorry, I'm getting the wrong. Yeah, it's a long day. But with the elk and so on, and you had the bison who were sort of grazing around, it ends up being this very natural type of setting where you have the animals graze intensively in one place and then move around in paddocks, and allowing time for the land to regenerate and for them to be able to, dig up the grass and put their own fertility back in the grass, and then they come around a bunch of months later. And this is called holistic grazing or rotational grazing, or some people call it bison-style grazing because it kind of imitates the way the bison used to roam around the Middle States before they all went extinct. But one of the things that happened when Cody switched over to this new form of farming was that he realized that all the illness in his cattle suddenly disappeared, and that he was no longer seeing all the upper respiratory diseases and a lot of the gastrointestinal diseases and autoimmune diseases that he had been seeing before in his cattle. And when I asked him why, he said, well, it's those microbes that are in the soil that are doing the trick. Well, Cody's a really smart guy, but he's a rancher. So I actually decided to go and talk to a scientist about it. And her name, this is Erika von Mutius, and she is in Munich, Germany. And she is the head of the Asthma and Allergy Hospital in Munich. And her whole research is studying what is called the farm effect, which is basically why is it that children that are raised on these sustainable farms in Europe that are very much like Cody's farm and the Hawkinson's farm have such low rates of asthma and allergy and even autoimmune disease. And I thought that Erika might be able to give me a little bit of insight into why Cody's cattle were so healthy. And so when I asked Erika, what's going on here? What is this farm effect? She went over to her computer and pulled up this picture. Kind of like the picture we saw earlier, right? With the kid running around after the elk. This one's even a little more daring because this guy is tiny, and he is in the bouncy seat with his belt on, but that cow is not restrained, I don't think. So she's studying why these kids have such low rates of allergy. And what do we see in the background? Hey, what do we call allergy? Hay fever. That, right away struck me. And then what do you see over on the left there? Milk. Do you think that's like pasteurized, homogenized, vitamin D added? Probably not. And maybe that child's not drinking it, but the other kids are drinking it. So what Erica von Mutius did was she actually went to this farm with her research crew and ended up swabbing everything on the farm. And she did that on dozens of farms throughout Bavaria. And then she was trying to ask a good research question. So she went into downtown Munich to the homes of her patients who have very high rates of allergy, and she swabbed their apartments. What do you think she found? Chemicals, someone said. Well, actually, she found plenty of bacteria and microbes and fungi in both places. But just like, remember that plot I showed you of the two kinds of fields, the organic and the conventional field? The concentrations of bacteria were way higher on the farm. And also, the diversity was much higher. So on the left, that's for bacteria, and that's on the right is fungi. And the y-axis is a measure of diversity. And the blue lines are the kids living on farms, and the red lines are the kids with asthma in the city. So you can see that there's just not a lot of diversity. It's kind of like they're in this monotony of microbes in these urban areas. And this has become such a theme, such a consistent discovery around the world as we're looking at this issue, that has led some of Dr. von Mutius's colleagues to start to map biodiversity indices against this, the incidence of both asthma and eczema, and also other forms of inflammatory disease, like even things like Crohn's disease and multiple sclerosis and so on, and rheumatoid arthritis. And what they've noticed is that as we're losing biodiversity on the planet, these diseases are going up. Now, I know that some of the scientists in this audience today would say that's probably just a coincidence. I will leave that for you to think about. Who knows? But it's really an interesting phenomenon, and it's, a lot of people are now, where we were talking about the hygiene hypothesis as the reason for these diseases, we're now talking about the biodiversity hypothesis. And I will let you choose what you would like to do to treat your own asthma and allergies. So finally, soil as nervous system. Now, this takes place, this story for me was learned on a farm that in Arkansas. And it was actually a farm that had been split into two different farms. The one on the left, on your left, is the original farm. And the one on the right is now what the farm is becoming. This is what it looks like inside those two. That's me in the lovely outfit on the right. I'm not sure if they were trying to protect the hens or protect me, but that's what I had to wear when I went on that farm. So what you see here on the left is an intense type of egg farming. 15,000 hens in a house. And what you see on the right is pasture-based farming, about 5,000 hens per field. By the way, the labels for these two kinds of eggs, if you were to buy them in the market, is free-range organic versus pasture-raised. Because those hens on the left are getting organic mash and they're free-range. They're not in cages. But that's just an aside. So take a guess here. Which of these hens, if you were to sort of like try to, put yourself in a hen-like, frame of mind, which of these hens do you think would be happier? The one on the right or the one on the left? The one on the right. Well, in fact, it has been studied. I don't know if they've won an egg prize or not. And they have found that, in fact, the ones on the right are happier by a bunch of hen-type indices. And it makes sense, right? Because they can fly around, their wings aren't clipped, they can roost, they can chase each other, they can dust bathe, which for anybody who raises chickens knows that's something you really want to do. They have access to sunshine, which is, improves your mood. They can actually eat worms, which they kind of evolved to do. But there's another reason they're happier that's not completely obvious, and it's kind of below the surface. And it has, once again, to do with this idea of microbes. And this is something that was actually discovered fairly serendipitously. But Mycobacterium vacca is a mycobacterium that's actually very harmless, but has been shown to produce a rather large inflammatory response in humans. And there were some cancer researchers who were very curious with these patients who had end-stage non-small cell lung cancer, whether they could use this as kind of a last-ditch therapy for these patients who really had a horrible life expectancy, to see if they could generate some kind of response and actually extend their life. So in a study, they gave half the cancer patients M-vacca to see what it would do. It turns out they died at the same rate as the patients who didn't get M-vacca. But what was so strange was that their quality of life scores that they were sort of reporting as a part of the research, that was sort of an aside of the research, was off the charts. They were dying a lot happier than the people who had not gotten M-vacca. And the researchers started to say, what is it about this microbe that might not be curing cancer, but actually might make people happy? And they have indeed started to discover that it seems by a mechanism that isn't completely clear, but potentially through the vagus nerve, which connects your gut to your brain, or potentially through some other factor they haven't fully understood, that it actually does affect brain cells. And they're able to give patients M-vacca and see how it lights up on the PET scan and seems to really positively affect mood. There's been studies done in rats, and they're starting to investigate this in humans, and there's people that's taken out patents on this. And the whole idea of soil bacteria making us happy and gardening making us happy got me so inspired that this month I wrote a piece for Yes magazine that apparently made them so happy that they put me on the cover. But I wanted to put this up because I've never been photographed holding my compost bucket before. And that, for me, was quite thrilling. So when you see a rancher like Cody on his knees staring at his grass, from now on you're going to think about this a little bit differently. This is actually a therapy appointment. He's actually getting a psychiatric treatment. So, and when you garden, sort of the same thing is going on. So here I've explained 3 different ways that our bodies are very intimately connected to soil, and that in fact it is a digestive system for us that prepares nutrients for us. It is part of our immune system in this very interesting way, and it even connects to our brain in terms of these microbes. And if you still don't believe me that we are so connected to soil, take a look at this. On the right, as you see, is a cross-section of soil, and on the left is a cross-section of skin. Or just look at a cross-section of our intestine in a cross-section of soil. Or back to the electron microscope level, can you tell which one of those is soil and microbes in the soil interacting with it, and which one is the inside of our intestine and the microbes in our intestine interacting with our food? You kind of can't. Very similar, huh? Because in fact, we are soil at the end of the day. Thanks.